Okay, hello everyone. I think I could see that most of the people have joined. So welcome to the episode 25 of the CEMS Webinar Series. Dr. Busch is back for round 2 of the CEMS Webinar Series. This round we will dive even deeper into the topic of serendipity. Have you ever wondered how can we set ourselves and others up for success and smart luck in a world full of uncertainty? Dr. Christian Busch buys exciting and life-changing book Connect the Dots, Art of Science of Creating Good Luck. By learning to identify, act on, and share serendipity, we can use uncertainty as a pathway to more joyful, purposeful, and successful lives. Christian Busch has studied hundreds of subjects who improved their lives by learning to see opportunities in the unexpected. But before we dive in, let's go over some housekeeping rules. So these are the rules, so please know that you are muted upon arrival. If you would like to interact live, please raise your hand and we are happy to unmute you. Also, we are using the Q&A function, so please use the Q&A box to ask your question to our speaker at the bottom of your screen. Feel free, the wonderful thing about the Q&A box is that you can feel free to upvote questions to make the most of our time together. And now we will introduce Dr. Christian Busch. He is a world-leading expert on innovation, purpose-driven leadership, and cultivating serendipity. He directs the CGA Global Economy program at New York University and also teaches at the London School of Economics. Previously, he co-directed the LSE's Innovation Lab and co-founded the Sandbox Network, a global community of young innovators as well as leaders on purpose, an organization convening leading CEOs. He is member of the World Economic Forum Expert Forum, a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, and among diplomatic careers, top 99 influencers and the Thinkers 50 Writers list of 30 thinkers most likely to shape the future. Christian's best-selling book, The Serendipity Mindset, has been highlighted as a wise, exciting, and life-changing book by Arianna Huffington, an embracing and hopeful antidote to a world addicted to efficiency and control by Daniel Pink that offers practical guidance for all. Now I will leave the floor to Christian. Welcome, Christian.
Well, thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, Victor. And Melissa, thank you so much for bringing us together. It's great to be here. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining. I'm very much looking forward to spending an hour together with you and to take you on a journey of connecting the dots and how we can create smart luck in our lives. I'd love to make it as interactive as possible. I'm a big believer that most of the knowledge usually is in the room rather than in the head of the presenter. So please do chip in whenever. You can use the chat function at any point in time. If you have any ideas, any thoughts, any questions, please just directly put them in the chat function and I'll try to pick them up as we go. Also, if you want to put in the chat what brings you here, you know, what's kind of your key curiosity at the moment when you hear all these kind of different things around serendipity and luck and connecting dots and other things. Is there something particular that you're curious about? If you want to put that in the chat, then I'll also try to bring that into the conversation, and in general, anything you'd like to share about yourself, from where you're tuning in, or what you're most excited about in your life at the moment, whatever it is, anything that you want to put in the chat for me then to kind of be able to navigate the session towards your interests and what gets you excited, the better. Now, to give you some context, so being the German I am, I have a PowerPoint presentation that I'll use a little bit, and then we'll dive into the conversation. Here is the presentation. Let's kind of get this up, and I'd love to take you on a journey here that starts essentially with growing up in Heidelberg in Germany, which I was kicked out of high school, had to repeat a year, probably held the unofficial world record of how many dustbins and trash cans you can knock over on your way to school when you're driving. And then one day wasn't so lucky anymore and crashed into 4 parked cars, all cars completely destroyed, including my own. And I won't forget the policeman who came to the scene, and he was like, oh my God, he's still alive. And you know, this idea that I was supposed to be dead, that stuck with me. And I asked myself all these weird questions, you know, if I would have died, who would have come to my funeral? Who would have actually cared? Was it all worth it? And at that point, I had mostly depressing answers. And so it took me on this intense search for meaning, trying to figure out what is life all about? Is there some kind of meaning to it all? And I started reading a book that I highly recommend, especially also in the times we live in, which is Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, which is all about the question of how do we find meaning in tough circumstances and crises and so on. And so I read that book, and what I realized is what gives me a lot of meaning is connecting ideas, connecting people, and that spark that comes from it. And so it took me on a journey as entrepreneur, social entrepreneur, community builder, and later into academia. And what I found fascinating on this journey is that the most inspiring, successful, purposeful people, they seem to have something in common, which is that they intuitively connect the dots. They intuitively see a little bit more in unexpected moments and then do something with it and turn it into positive outcomes. They cultivate serendipity. And so I got very excited by that question, if there's a science-based framework for this. Is there a way that we can learn how to create this unexpected good luck in some way or the other, even though that's obviously quite counterintuitive? And so this is really the content I'll talk about today, which is in the book that just came out, Connect the Dots, which is the international paperback version extended of the Serendipity mindset. And so that kind of, I'll share a lot of the content of this in this session today. And before I do this, also, by the way, if you want to put in the chat, if you had any experiences in your own life around serendipity or around kind of unexpected good luck and what it was about it, please do put it in the chat. Anything that comes to mind. Jack Wurr is asking, what was the book mentioned? That's Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl. So now, why is this so important? This kind of building this muscle for the unexpected, building the idea that we can cultivate serendipity out of the unexpected. Well, of course, there's a lot of individual uncertainty at the moment, right? We all go through some kind of transitions. There's new ways of working and living. There's complex societal and environmental challenges. And so essentially life is often shaped by the unexpected. That's a lot of times how we find love. That's a lot of times how up to 50% of inventions and innovations, they emerge serendipitously so. And so cultivating serendipity, we've seen in our work as one of the key life skills and ability in a world that is full of uncertainty. Now, a couple of examples of serendipity here. On the upper left, you see, an example of a coffee shop. Imagine you are in a coffee shop, and imagine you have erratic hand movements like I do, and you spill coffee over someone, and that person looks at you slightly annoyedly, but you sense there might be something there. You don't know what it is, you just sense there might be something there. Now you have two options, right? Option number one is you just say, I'm sorry. You walk outside and you think, what could have happened had I spoken with the person? Option number two, you start a conversation and that person turns out to become the love of your life or your co-founder or your next supplier, you name it. The point is that our reaction to the unexpected, us making the accident meaningful in a way, then guides us towards potential serendipity or not. RLabs is one of my favorite organizations. They teach low-cost education modules in sub-Saharan Africa. And they, when COVID happened, they usually teach programs in person, and COVID happened, very unexpected events. And they realized, oh, wow, maybe we can then teach our sessions via WhatsApp. So they developed WhatsApp modules for their training program, which now they sell to other companies and to organizations, and it became one of their main revenue drivers. Again, an unexpected event, and they did something with it, turned it into opportunity. Here's a couple of individuals who did that really well. We'll touch on that later on. But for now, any ideas what this might be here on the lower right? Any ideas? Again, you can use the chat function. If you have any ideas what this might be on the lower right. Any ideas what this might be? Penicillin, Maria says, yeah, close. So it's usually, yes, Mike is coming very close. I just wanted to say it's usually a good sign if you don't know what it is. Now I can't say this anymore, but so essentially this is a couple of years ago, some researchers gave people medication against angina, the heart pain, and they realized that male participants' trousers, there was some kind of movement happening. And what would we usually do? We would probably say, oh my God, that's embarrassing. Oh my God, let's ignore this. Oh my God, let's find a way to get rid of this side effect. Well, they did the opposite. They said, you know what? That's unexpected. But there's probably a lot of men in the world who might have a problem in this department. So why don't we develop a medication around it? And that's indeed how Viagra, here under the generic name sildenafil, came about. Any ideas what this might be here on the upper right? Any ideas what this might be on the upper right? Chicken fryer. Any ideas what this might be? So this is a sweet potato washing machine. And a couple of years ago, a company in China called Haier, they produce washing machines and refrigerators and so on. And they received calls from farmers. And the farmers told them, your crappy washing machine is always breaking down. Well, why is the washing machine breaking down? Well, we're trying to wash our potatoes in it and it doesn't seem to work. So what would we usually do? We would probably say, well, that's a clothes washing machine. Why would you wash your potatoes? Don't do that, right? Let's educate the customer. Well, they did the opposite. They said, you know what? That's unexpected. But there's probably a lot of farmers in China who have a similar problem. So why don't we build in a dirt filter and make it a potato washing machine? And that's how the potato washing machine became one of their products. Now, what all these examples and hundreds of other examples that we studied have in common is that it's not just something that happens to us, right? It's not kind of blind luck that's just about being born into a loving family, but it's smart luck. It's luck we create ourselves. It's serendipity. It's a process where there's always some kind of serendipity trigger, right? So there's some unexpected moment like spilling the coffee or movement in male participants' trousers or farmers calling up and saying your washing machine is breaking down. But then we have to do something with it. We have to imbue meaning. We have to connect the dots to something meaningful and then also have the tenacity to go through with it. It's not enough to just, like run into this potential love interest in the coffee shop. You got to go on dates, right? Or you got to go on meetings with a potential partner. And so the point is that we have to a lot of times have tenacity to actually turn that into potential serendipity. And a lot of times there's a long incubation time. It takes quite long from the initial thing to then actually the manifestation of a positive outcome. The point here is once we look at serendipity as a process of spotting and connecting dots, we can influence that process, right? We can create more potential serendipity triggers. We can learn how to connect the dots better, and we can build a muscle for that whole process. And so I'll dive a bit more into this in a second. In organizations then, in companies, we can create the enablers and constraints for more of this to happen. And I'll talk more about this in a second. Of course, the problem is that we tend to miss serendipity all the time because we might not see the trigger, we might not be able to connect the dots, or we might just not have the tenacity to go through with it. Now, to give an example, there's a lot of questions usually around how do you study serendipity, right? Like, how do you know that something is serendipitous versus not? There's a lot of different experiments where you could, for example, put people into the same situation that's unexpected to them, and then you see how they react differently, and one might create a lucky outcome, the other not. A lot of our work is qualitative in the sense that we observe over long time periods what happens when people have unexpected moments, and then what do they do with this. But one of my favorite experiments is an experiment where they compared lucky and unlucky people. And I'd love to ask you actually, if you want to put in the chat, who of you consider yourself to be lucky versus unlucky? So I consider myself to be quite lucky. Do you consider yourself to be lucky or unlucky? Susanna lucky, Maria lucky, Bianca lucky, Francesco lucky, Rene lucky, Andy lucky, Egon lucky, Victor lucky, Thomas lucky, Antonia neutral, Nicole lucky. So it seems like we have a mostly lucky room. There's probably a certain self-selection that the unlucky ones might not post as much as the lucky ones. But so in general, it seems like, okay, we do have a relatively lucky room here. Now, the reason I asked you this, Mike says, answered lucky last time, changing my answer to unlucky in view of the circumstances. Interesting. And Mike will talk more about this, I'm sure, later on, but that's an interesting point that circumstances can change, right? A lot of times what's interesting, and we'll talk more about this, is that unlucky events can sometimes become inflection points of potential serendipity later on. I mean, a lot of people, who have inspiring stories, a lot of times started in some kind of hardship, right? The breakup, for example, an emotional situation in the moment feels like the end of the world, but it in a way is quote unquote required in order for someone to then be open to meet the true love of their life, right? And that's the same in a lot of other aspects, that potentiality a lot of times also comes out of crisis moments. Of course, not always, and that's a whole conversation itself. But we'll dive more into this in a second. The reason I asked you this is one of my favorite experiments that I want to briefly tell you about, which is they usually, when you say you consider yourself to be lucky, you tend to be luckier in the future. And Mike, that's something where it's interesting that you kind of changed your perspective on that, in terms of how our context a lot of times has different impacts on us, right? In this one example, they pick people who consider themselves to be lucky and people who consider themselves to be very unlucky, and they tell them, walk down the street, go into a coffee shop, grab a coffee, sit down, and then we'll have a conversation. What they don't tell them is that there's hidden cameras alongside the street and in the coffee shop. There's a £5 note, so money, right in front of the coffee shop. And then inside the coffee shop, there's one empty table, one empty seat next to this extremely successful businessman who can make big dreams happen. Now, the lucky person walks down the street, sees the £5 note, picks it up, goes into the coffee shop, grabs a coffee, sits down, has a conversation with the businessman. They exchange business cards, potentially an opportunity coming out of it. The unlucky person walks down the street, steps over the £5 note, so doesn't see it, goes in the shop, orders the coffee, sits next to the businessman, ignores the businessman, that's it. Now, at the end of the day, they ask both people, how was your day today? And so the lucky person says, well, it was amazing. I found money in the street, made a new friend, and, potentially an opportunity coming out of it. The unlucky person just says, well, nothing really happened. And, you can replicate that experiment in a lot of different settings where you can put people into exactly the same situation. And depending on how they look at the world, depending on how they perceive the world, they will have very different outcomes. I find a lot of money in the street because I expect it to be there. Mostly pennies, unfortunately, so it doesn't really change my lifestyle. But I'll really ask you, when you kind of open your eyes to, for example, money in the street, I guarantee you will find it more often. The same when you take another street to work and, you open your eyes, instead of just looking on the phone, you might see that book in a bookstore. Oh my God, that could be a podcast idea. Or, oh my God, that could be a movie, or whatever it is. The point is that we start to see things in the unexpected once we open our eyes to it. Now, what I'd love to do with you is a small experiment. And before I do this, I think Mike hinted to a really important point, right? That there's usually two things that play a major role here. One is objective constraints and objective situations that are a tough kind of starting position, right? So a lot of my work is in extreme poverty contexts, and the starting position of someone who is in an extreme poverty context is very different from someone like me here in the West Village in New York, having access to education, networks, and so on. And so there's structural constraints that keep people from having more serendipity. And so that has to go hand in hand, of course, working on this, then working on the mindset. But importantly, it's not an either or. We have to do both at the same time. And so what I found fascinating is I will never forget the first time I went to work in Kenya and South Africa. There's an amazing organization, Reconstructed Living Labs, and they essentially taught me a lot about also social constructedness in our lives, right? So essentially that there's objective constraints and then there's socially constructed constraints. And so I remember going to Cape Town, to the Cape Flats, and I asked them, what is the one thing I should never ask you? I, as the person coming into your context, what is it that you always hear from people, but you really don't want to be asked? And they told me, well, never ask us first what you need, because if you ask us what we need, you put us into the role of the victim, the beneficiary, the person who needs your benevolence. If you ask us instead, what is already here and how can we make the best of it, then you put us into a position where we start on the same level, and then later we can still talk about resourcing. And so what they do a lot is they go into a different context of poverty, and they say the first question, what's already here and how can we make the best of it? There's a former drug dealer, perfect. That person, probably is very resourceful, has a lot of creativity and a lot of social capital. And if we can turn them into a teacher, we can turn a whole community around. When we look at an old garage, we see a potential training center. And so it's this kind of idea that in every given situation, there's always the question of, can you still imbue some sort of meaning? And that's actually what Viktor Frankl did a lot. Viktor Frankl was interesting because he was in a concentration camp, which objectively is the toughest situation you can be in, right? There's like, you're almost guaranteed that you will die and there's no way out. And Viktor Frankl always wondered, why did I, Victor, survive psychologically? Because of course, objectively speaking, from your objective reality, there's almost no choice out. But he constructed his own meaning in the situation. He said, you know what? I will try to take as much power as I can back. So he did two things. One is he said, look, when I get out of this hellhole, I still want to write a book. So he had some kind of big meaning out there. And he also had these kind of ideas of, hey, I still want to talk with other prisoners every day I wake up. And by doing this now, I have a reason to wake up tomorrow morning. I've seen that a lot in COVID, right? Where people derived a lot of meaning from saying, if my elderly neighbor can't like go shopping, I can go shopping for them. And that now gives me a reason to wake up tomorrow morning and to not just feel completely depressed. And so what I've always been fascinated by is that serendipity a lot of times also relies on our social constructiveness of the world and seeing more in a moment than meets the eye. And we'll talk more about this in a second. But before I do this, I really want to dive more into these kind of self-limiting beliefs that we all have, right? Some kind of biases and so. But before doing this, and I need everyone's collaboration here. It will only work if everyone collaborates with us. So I'd love you to imagine you're sitting next to the person you love the most, right? And I will not put you on the spot to say who that is, but the person who's dearest to you, right? It might be your mother, your father, your sister, your brother, your significant other. So imagine that one person being next to you now in front of the screen. And in a way, then we would be 74 people in this room, right? So it's the 37 people in this room plus the imaginary friend that's next to you, right? And now I would like to ask you, what do you think is the probability in this room of 74 people that two people have the same birthday? Is it, 5%, 7%, 10%? What do you think is the probability that two people in this room of 74 people have the same birthday? So they celebrate on the same day. What is the probability? Who's good at maths? Who can calculate this? Anyone wants to make a guess? Any ideas? Is it 5%, 7%, 10%, 50%, 3%, 7%? Who's good at maths? 3%? Any maths crack here? How would you calculate this? So 1%, 4%, 9, 94, 1. All right. So Francesco, 6%. So we have a nice range here, right? But we would probably, most of us would agree it's a quite low probability. Now I need everyone to do the following: put your birthday and the birthday of your imaginary person into the chat. And if you see an overlap, please let us know the two names of the people who have an overlap. So in my case, it's February 22nd and November 6th. So everyone, please put those 2 dates into the chat. And then if you spot an overlap, please let us know. So please go through. And then if you see two people who have the same birthday, please let us know. Again, please put your own birthday and the birthday of your significant person. And then tell us if you see any overlaps of two people, please give us the two names of the people so that we see who is that. I'm usually extremely slow with this. Please make sure to not put to host and panelists only, but to put to everyone, right? So that we all see it. I think a lot of you answer to host and panelists, which then the others can't see. So please, in the chat, you can see it says two, and then for some of you, it might say two hosts and panelists. Please put to everyone so that everyone can see it. Here's a couple that posted just to host, so I'll just put them here as well. But I'm like, okay, all right, great. So if you see two overlaps, please let us know. And again, we need everyone to collaborate. And if anyone sees two overlaps, please let us know. Okay, fantastic. So Leon says October 30th twice by Zubin and myself. So we have our first birthday pair here. Please do send each other birthday cards, right? Leon and Zubin, congratulations on being the first birthday pair here. Again, if you see other overlaps here, please let us know. But essentially, oh yes, Andui says June 11th twice by Maria and me. So that's our second birthday pair. Antonia says Ricardo and me, October 22nd. So that's the third pair. So we already have three birthday pairs now, right? And if we would continue and if everyone would chip in, usually in a group of 70 people, we will have 4 to 8 birthday pairs, which is incredible, right? Because we said the probability of one birthday pair is quite limited, quite low, but now of 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, like that's mind blowing, isn't it? Because you essentially, that's an even a smaller likelihood of that happening. Now, this is exactly one of the key biases that keeps us from having more serendipity in our lives, that we think about this problem similar to how we think about life in general, right? We think it's linear, we think it's step by step, you can know the variables and you can know everything. But if you take that mindset that we learned in school, then you would just say, right, 365 days in the year, 74 people, you divide them by each other, very low probability, right? So that's the kind of like the linear approach to life type approach. But in this example, it's exponential, right? It's an exponential function, it's to the power of. So if Antonia has 73 people in this room who could have the same birthday, Nicole still has 72 people, and Francesco still has 71 people if they didn't have the same birthday, and so on. And so essentially, it is extremely likely, and Mike hit the nail on the head, that the likelihood was extremely high. The likelihood was almost 100% that two people in this room would have the same birthday. Usually with 23 people already in a room, you have a 50% likelihood that two people have the same birthday. 23 people has a 50% likelihood that two people have the same birthday in a room. And so what I want to show you with this example, and those of you interested in the maths behind this is the birthday paradox. You can Google the birthday paradox. But the point here is that similar to life, it's an exponential function where there's so many potential connections between dots. It's not about the individual dots. Similar to quantum theory, the idea is that you have the connections between dots that count, and those connections are to the number of. And that's the potentiality of serendipity, right? That there could be so many potential unexpectedly positive things, but we tend to miss them because we don't believe they're there. And that's not due to some kind of voodoo type stuff. That's literally due to alertness and to not seeing it in the moment, like the $5 note, because we don't expect it to be there. So long story short, we have a lot of biases like underestimating the likelihood of the unexpected, which keeps us from having more positively unexpected moments in our life. Now, there's a lot of other biases. One of my favorites is the post-rationalization, right? We've probably all done it. It gives us this kind of feeling of control. I work a lot with senior executives, and when you work with senior executives, they will come into a boardroom and they will say, I had this strategy, then I made this happen, and then exactly this happened, right? Very linear story. Everyone in this room knows that this is not how it works. Everyone in this room knows that it's a bit more like a squiggle. And that's probably similar to, I don't know, when you go to your employer, your future employer, and you say, this is my CV, I did this, and then I wanted to do this, and that's this. Yeah, or maybe you just ran into someone at a conference and then this happened unexpectedly and this and this and this. So the point is that a lot of times we airbrush serendipity out of our stories because we want to show this kind of control that we had. And one of the purposes of the work that we've been doing is around saying, instead of seeing the unexpected as a potential threat, right, as something that seems it threatens our plans, something that makes us seem we're not in control, actually the right mindset and creating a culture for serendipity means that actually you gain more control over uncertainty because you're not trying to stick to a plan that anyways will probably not work, but you create an environment that makes it more likely that the unexpected happens. What do I mean with this? So for example, we just finished a study with over 40 of the world's leading CEOs, CEOs of big companies like MasterCard and others. And we sat down with them and we said, what is it that makes you really successful? And what one of the key determining factors is that they're extremely good at saying, here's a sense of direction. Here's a key direction we're going into. Or as an individual, here's a key curiosity or something that gives me a certain sense of where I'm going. So I know what to connect the dots to. Here's an approximate strategy, an approximate plan, but I'm already telling you now in advance that I will adjust this exact plan, this exact strategy based on new information coming in. And this is not a bad thing. Like in the example of the potato washing machine, Viagra, and up to 50% of innovations, that's actually the only way to realize what could be even more valuable. Because in a world that has so many potential variables, we cannot know things a priori all the time. And so we have to adjust as we go. And so that's a big shift in terms of leadership, right? To say, yes, we try to plan as much as we can, but we're building the unexpected into the planning. And we don't see the unexpected as a threat, but rather as a necessary part of our plan. And that's not a weakness. Now, I've talked a lot about the kind of key ideas here, but now I want to briefly talk about 4 practices that we can all use to have more serendipity in our life, and then we'll dive into the Q&A session. Now, how can we set ourselves up to have more serendipity in our lives? One strategy is the hook strategy. It's one of my favorites, which is all about the idea that we can all think about memorable talking points in our lives, some kind of curiosity or interest that we can seed into every conversation. So for example, in my case, it's a lot about how do we take the serendipity mindset into as many schools and universities and businesses as we can. And so I built that into every conversation. And the amount of times people would be like, oh my God, such a coincidence. My aunt is teaching at a school. I should put you in touch, stuff like that. It's extremely high. So I'm a big fan of really kind of stepping back and thinking about what are some key curiosities I have at the moment. Is it finding a job in XYZ industry? Is it learning more about quantum physics, whatever it is, and then seeding that into different conversations. And usually from the most unexpected of places, someone might unexpectedly have a solution. Someone who does that really well is Ollie Barrett. Ollie is a wonderful entrepreneur in London. And if you would ask Ollie this dreaded "what do you do" question, right, that you get at every conference, he wouldn't just say, I'm a technology entrepreneur. He would say something like, I'm a technology entrepreneur, recently started reading into the philosophy of science, but what I'm really excited about is playing the piano. And so what he's doing here is he's giving you 3 potential hooks where you could be like, oh my God, such a coincidence. We're hosting piano sessions. You should stop by. Oh my God, such a coincidence. My sister's teaching on the philosophy of science. You should give a guest lecture. The point is seeding those in conversations can help us find those unexpected common denominators. The other way around, of course, we can also ask questions differently, right? Instead of asking the dreaded, what do you do questions or things like this, we can ask more open-ended questions like, what do you enjoy doing, right? It's a very small shift, but by doing this, we get people out of their autopilot, away from the what do you do, I'm this, to what do you enjoy doing? Oh, what I'm actually enjoy doing is XYZ. Again, that's where a lot of interesting overlaps tend to emerge. The second one is around crisis or mistakes as inflection points, right? So a lot of times, out of situations that didn't work, interesting things emerge. In companies, that's a lot of times a problem because in companies, we usually only talk about the things that did work. And then whenever something doesn't work, we try to hide it away, right? We don't want to be the loser who's responsible for not bringing an idea through or something like this, which is a pity because a lot of times that's where the most interesting learning and the most interesting bonding comes from. And so I'm a big fan of the project funeral. And the project funeral is the idea that whenever something didn't work out, the person who's responsible for it lays it to rest in front of people from other divisions or other teams, and they reflect on what they learned from it. So it's not about celebrating failure, it's about celebrating what didn't work. And so in this one example, there's a company that produces this amazing window glass and amazing technology, but the project manager realized that the market is not just big enough, it's just not big enough. So they laid it to rest and they said, look, I learned that next time I have to understand the market better. Now, someone in the audience goes like, hey, have you considered what this would mean for solar? Have you considered if we would take that technology into a solar context, how much energy that might absorb? And that is how Serendipity, so part of their solar division, emerged, but also that is how they build much more trust in the organization. Of course, these kind of things work better in organizations where there's some kind of trust already. And we could have a whole session about how you build that trust into more collaborative cultures, for example, having some kind of joint purpose, having some kind of integrated values, whatever it is. But the key point here is we can incentivize people to connect the dots for each other, which a lot of times also creates a bit more of a sense of belonging and trust. Another easy practice here is the serendipity spotting. For example, asking people in meetings, what surprised you last week? Oh, it surprised you that farmers were washing their potatoes in the washing machine. Interesting. Let's legitimize this unexpected thing. And so what it does is it essentially makes it normal that the unexpected is being observed, and it actually makes it much cheaper to have unexpected things that don't work also because you see them early on in the process. It also is more fun, by the way, because it makes people feel, oh, I can actually think about things that I find interesting, surprising, joyful, but also it's not that bad then if something goes wrong. A company that does it really well and creates that kind of culture is Pixar, right? One of the most creative companies in the world. And Pixar starts meetings, for example, or used to start meetings with a question of, or with the announcement, at the beginning, all of our ideas are bad or all of our movies are bad. Now let's start the meeting. What you're doing here is you're giving people the permission to come up with unexpected ideas that are maybe not yet so mature that you would feel to bring them up. And that's really one of the most important things. And when you reflect on your own experiences where maybe serendipity could have happened, but it didn't, right? So maybe in a meeting, you had that unexpected ideas, but you didn't bring it up. Or in that coffee shop, you wanted to speak with a person, but you didn't because you didn't feel ready or had a fear of rejection or imposter syndrome, whatever it is. when you think back to these situations in your life where serendipity could have happened, but it didn't, that usually gives us a really interesting idea of the pattern behind what holds us back. And then we can work on that deeper pattern. So for example, in my case, I used to have a deep fear of rejection. And so, sometimes I would not bring up things because I would be afraid of it. But then I realized, what? The worst thing that can happen is not the sting of rejection, right? Which is really kind of, it sucks, right? To be rejected, like from, going to a conference, wanting to speak with a speaker and they say, I don't have time for you, or the love interest that says, that's not a real fit, whatever it is. But I realized that's not the worst thing that can happen. The worst thing that can happen actually is the regret that comes from not doing it, right? So not speaking with that person in the coffee shop, walking outside and thinking, what could have happened had I spoken with the person? Or in the meeting, what could have happened had I brought up the idea? And so it's a very Mark Twain idea that in a way, at the end of life, you will not regret the things usually that you have done a lot of times, but a lot of times the things you haven't done. And so really kind of reframing away from what's the worst thing that can happen if I do it to what's the worst thing that can happen if I don't do it? And that's really a lot of times around regrets of not acting on an unexpected idea or an unexpected solution. Now, a third practice is, in the times we live in, COVID and post-COVID and in between COVID and whatever type of period we're in now, of course, a lot of times those kind of water cooler moments in companies have been taken away from us, right? Where we could just randomly run into the boss of our boss and then have that amazing opportunity come out of it. And so a big question that I've had in my work is, how do you recreate those moments online or virtually? And so I'm a big fan of practices such as random coffee trials, where people within an organization or within a community get a couple of times, they put a couple of times when they're free, and then they get randomly matched across the organization with people who put the same time for a quick coffee. And that coffee could have an inspiring prompt like, what's the challenge you're facing at the moment and how can I help you? Whatever it is. But what it does is it recreates those water cooler moments. And now every week something exciting could happen. And importantly, also, it kind of creates a bit more of a sense of belonging again with people we might not have been in touch with. We are communicating a lot, but usually always with the same people. Now, last but not least, I already mentioned that one key practice is to develop some sort of sense of direction, some kind of North Star. People like Paul Pullman are extremely good at this, or some kind of curiosity that helps us guiding. Again, I think there's a lot of pressure usually to say, find your purpose, find your passion. I'm a much bigger fan of saying, find one or two curiosities and then use those as hooks and kind of explore as you go. And that a lot of times lets you rubber stamp into the areas you're really interested in. Now, to wrap this up, and then we'll dive into the Q&A. If you have any questions, please do put them in the chat and the Q&A function. A lot of this work is around normalizing imperfection. Nobody's perfect. I'm a new parent. I can tell you, right? Parents, we're all just winging it most of the time. There's no way to just plan everything out. The same in business. I work a lot with very high profile individuals. I can tell you after the third glass of red wine, everyone will tell you that speech that I gave in the morning that seemed like so well rehearsed, I just made it up. I had to wing it because we had new information, explicit, blah, blah. The point is that a lot of times, the inner imposter might come out and things like this, but that's normal, right? We all have it, and some of us are better at hiding it. Now, I think there's a lot of ways we can go about this, right? Role modeling, and really showing people, hey, it's okay to not be always perfect. We all want to avoid mistakes that can be avoided. And I grew up in Germany, right? We love structure, we love planning and everything else. And then you go out in the real world and you realize, oh my God, the real world is not just planning and structuring and everything being perfect all the time. And doesn't have to be a problem. Imperfection actually becomes an inflection point for beautiful things if we see it as that. Acknowledging anxiety is one, right? It gives a big sense of control that once you acknowledge things that you cannot control, you move on from them and you move towards things you can control. Gives this huge, beautiful moment of, wow, here's something I can control. Viktor Frankl always said that beautifully, right along the lines of, you can't always control the situation, but you can always control your response to it. And that defines, right, if the situation defines you or if you can define the situation as well. I'm a big fan of taking the long view. I've seen that a lot in terms of how much it has helped me to think about in any kind of crisis. Okay, in 10 years from now, will this really matter? And if not, well, why do I worry as much about it? Because, what I've seen a lot in our work is that a happy ending really depends on when we look at it and when we end the story. right? And if you end the story too early, it might not be a happy ending, and the unhappy ending might define us for the rest of our life, right? Then we are the person who was broken up with, versus if you continue, then a lot of times it might become the inflection point. I'm a big fan also, there's a lot of things around social capital we can talk about. Those of you are interested to really think about what's the latent social capital, so the things that are out there that we don't see, but by putting hooks out there, for example, we might realize that our friend actually knows someone who could help us without us even knowing that they might know someone who could help us, and so on. There's a lot of other things, but I think for now, let me wrap this up on a psychological, on a philosophical point. In Heidelberg, one of my favorites who was writing on the beautiful philosopher's way there is Goethe. And Goethe had this beautiful idea that if you take someone as they are, you make them worse, but if you take them as what they could be, you make them capable of becoming what they can be. And that's what serendipity is all about. Serendipity is about potentiality. It's about what could be. It's about seeing a little bit more in a moment, seeing a little bit more in unexpected situations, seeing a little bit more in a person, and then grasping that opportunity and turning it into positive outcomes. And so I hope that this talk and this presentation might inspire in some way or the other. I mean, you're obviously the future of leadership, right? And you'll go out there and inspire a lot of people. And I think giving people the opportunity to have their own serendipity, to have their own smart luck, is one of the most dignifying moves that one can do, instead of just pushing things on them and thinking we know it all. And so with this, thank you so very much. And I'm handing over to Victor for the Q&A.
Yes, perfect, Christian. I think it was very interesting, very inspiring. We actually have one question from Ricardo. For the others, feel free to use the question and answer box if you want to ask something, Christian. I think it's very limited opportunity to get more about the topic, which is very interesting and can aspect you in your life. So moving on to Ricardo's question, he asks, super interesting aspects. May I ask how to deal with these unexpected events while planning a path, be it career related or personal? Is there a way to take this into account to a certain extent?
Yeah, thank you, Ricardo. That's a great question. One thing that I found very useful is to not fall in love with the outcome, but to really kind of have a sense of where you're going, right? So let's say you want to have a job at McKinsey, right? Or whatever it is, right? If you just focus on this one job at McKinsey, you might not see all the amazing opportunities that are all around you in similar organizations where you could do the same thing, but it might not be McKinsey. Because if you would say something like, my job is to have an amazing position where I can advise people, and I will take McKinsey as one potential strategy, one potential plan, but also now I'm opening up to other things, then a lot of times you might realize the former McKinsey boss actually is now running their own consultancy. And that's much more exciting because they can directly put you into leadership positions later on in companies. Things like this, where you might then kind of like be able to have the same focus, right? Focus can be extremely important to get things done, to celebrate milestones, to know when you're successful. So that's really important to have some kind of plan, but also then building in this idea that it doesn't have to be exactly that way. It doesn't have to be exactly McKinsey. It could also be Bain. It could be Boston Consulting Group, whatever it is. That's one. I always remember, one of my mentors at the LSE. So I used to study at the LSE, and one of my favorite mentors, he always used to say, Christian, people like you always think there's one road to Rome, so one street to Rome, the city, and then you realize you don't even want to be in Rome. And to me, that always kind of resonated a lot. This idea that yes, we're always like focusing so much on a particular outcome, and then we reach the outcome, and we're like, yeah, do I really like meet this and this, or did I something else? And so it's kind of the idea of not attaching too much to the outcome itself, but rather to the journey towards it, and understanding of how that kind of could lead to different types of outcomes, which all might be sometimes even better than that particular one. So concretely speaking, I'm a big fan of really writing down those kind of curiosities in terms of, okay, I would love to consult with high profile clients. Okay, I would love to work with amazing teams. Okay, I would love to XYZ. Here's a couple of ways I could do that. One is joining McKinsey, but maybe there's a couple of other ways too. And that's what I use for hooks. And then I see and put myself into communities and see what's emerging. And I think it really comes back to that idea of the more you are over-focused, the more you might miss opportunities around you if you don't see them. I've had a lot of people, for example, who friends would tell them, hey, I have a perfect position for you. And they would say, no, this is absolutely not what I'm supposed to do now, because they had in their mind this one thing. And then half a year later, they're like, oh my God, like this one position doesn't get hired for that I thought I would get hired for. Now can I get the job? And the job is gone. And so the point is that it's really kind of widening a little bit the idea of what am I looking for, but also then in a way allowing yourself to rubber stamp forward within that. But again, it's very contextual. It's very depends on oneself. But I'm a big fan of planning, but then also saying it doesn't have to be exactly that plan. And if it goes differently, that's fine too. And that's where a lot of the most amazing opportunities come from.
Yes, I just wanted to mention, I think very interesting. I think we got a question, because I would also be a similar question like JQ, that how to avoid getting overwhelmed by the number of possibilities when you start seeing them everywhere. Is that you said, yeah, I have a focus, but what if I found on my way that, for example, I want to change focus, or there are so many possibilities today. So what would be your advice to this, or how to approach this?
That's a great question. I think two things. So one person to really learn in that regard from is Paul Polman. He used to be the CEO of Unilever, and he was extremely good at saying, I have a certain sense of where I'm going in terms of I want to help people at scale. I want to help as many people as possible. You know how some people want to help at depth. So they might go and become a psychologist and work with one person really deep. And then there's people like Polman who say, I want to work with as many people as possible and inspire them. And so he first thought, well, I'll do that as a priest. But then he realized, oh no, I can do that much more effectively if I take a big company and make them have more impact. So the point here is that he had some kind of sense of direction. And when he meets people, when he was still running Unilever, and he would meet people and someone would pitch an idea to him, he would always look from the prism of, how does that help me now with Unilever help even more people do X, Y, Z thing? And so that was a prism for him. That was a filter, a funnel. And so to me, it's always been extremely useful to identify the kind of key theme at the moment, and then use that as a kind of selection criteria for the kind of opportunities, and then everything else, putting that on the parking lot. I remember when I was still kind of running companies, essentially, we would have all these unexpected opportunities, right? Oh my God, maybe we could get this meeting with this person, or this. And one thing I learned from a co-founder of mine that I'm still very grateful for is to have a parking lot. So to have a sheet, literally kind of a Google Doc or so, where you just put all the things that you could potentially do, but that are not priority at the moment, and just putting them there and leaving them there. So you don't feel they're all gone, but they're just there. And then you get back to them at some other point. And that's really kind of the key, right? You can only get stuff done if you really prioritize it at some point. And so I found it very useful to have some kind of informal, Pixar does that really well. They have a brain trust where you have a couple of people, whenever an idea comes up, they briefly say, makes sense, make no sense, should be on a parking lot. And I do the same in my personal life, where I come up with a lot of things, but then I briefly talk it through with my partner or friends, and then kind of like, in a way, have a pre-screening and then focus a little bit on this. And my key selection usually is around values and around what does feel true to me. It wouldn't feel true to me, for example, I was invited to a presentation in by a company that I don't endorse, because they do a lot around tobacco and stuff. And so, yes, I could have taken that opportunity, but it didn't feel true to the core. And so I would then in those situations say no. And so I think having some kind of non-negotiable values, some kind of sense of where we're going, but also people around us who can help us make sense out of things, I think that a lot of times can be helpful.
Okay, yeah, I have very helpful advice to every one of us. So let's go down to Q&A back, because we have one question that's been upvoted. So it's from Mike Erkulev, and he's saying, I'm originally from Russia, currently on the run in Uzbekistan, and have experienced a large amount of bad luck within the last few months. Visa rejections, frozen assets, decrease in living conditions, standards, and a general sense of uncertainty and fear for my life. So my question to you, how can serendipity be used in the situation where the number of opportunities available is shrinking dramatically?
Yeah, that's a great question. And first of all, I'm sorry to hear. I mean, it sounds like a tough situation. And, it comes back to what I mentioned earlier about that we can never blame people for tough situations, right? All of us could get cancer. All of us might have really bad luck, right? Like really bad luck. And one can never blame for it, but also it's objectively a tough situation, right? And so I think it comes back to the Viktor Frankl idea earlier, that there's an objective reality of things that are objective constraints, right? So these kind of things that you mentioned are objectively tough. So that's the kind of objective reality. A lot of these we can't control, right? So my approach there is always to say, okay, what are the things I can't control, and how do I try to let go of as much as this and not focus too much on this, because there's nothing I can do about it, versus what are the things that are under my control. And that's usually a lot of times, how do I imbue meaning in this in some sense that it could become an inflection point? So for example, if there is I mentioned R Labs, Reconstructed Living Labs, the organization, the Cape Plus in Cape Town. COVID almost meant bankruptcy for them, because essentially from one day to the other, they were wiped out, like no more potential clients coming in. And so essentially it could have been bankruptcy. And so they objectively, it was a really bad situation. And then they said, okay, is there something we can still do in this situation? Is there something here that, okay, we can't teach in person, but now, because we don't have resources to do anything else, but we're anyways all on WhatsApp. So can we somehow use what we anyways have here to then do a nano course where we teach people from the WhatsApp, because it doesn't cost us anything to do that. And so I always love what they do, which is essentially always saying, whatever we have at hand now, is there still something we can do with this? And so I've seen that approach translated right to banks, for example, when tough recession or COVID type things hit. The easy way for a bank would be to say, we just fire people, or we just kind of put people into like out of work. This approach would be to say, no, can the person we would fire maybe become a financial trainer, and like the old office could be a financial training center, whatever it is, the reframing of that situation. Again, I'm very hesitant to be very concrete about your situation, because I think there's so much contextual dynamics and so much, like obviously so much tough things that are happening at the same time, that, you know, it might be objectively just extremely tough to just operate within this. And then at the same time, I think what our labs kind of teaches us, I think a lot, is around this idea that there's always something at this point where we can try to figure out, is there something we can do with this related situation? Sandbox, take Sandbox, a company that I co-founded a couple of years ago. You know, we literally started when the recession hit, and we were almost bankrupt, and like we were like, shoot, like life is over. But to us, when looking back, it was the best thing that could have happened to us, because we didn't have resources. We had to completely rethink the model. Instead of one big conference where like everyone would come and that would have cost a lot of money, we started local. We said local communities that didn't cost us anything to create first, and then later on, when times would get better, we would do the big thing. So very long story short, I don't have, unfortunately, the perfect answer for you, but my hunch always is to always focus on the things that we can control rather than the things that we can't.
Yes, thank you. Hope that it's a good answer for you, Mike, and also my best luck from my side to you. Going on with the project, I think it's nice to have Christian as a positive person, but we continue a bit with the crisis team, or with the theme of with the topic of dealing with serendipity in a bad situation. So we have a question from Maria saying, linking how serendipity can be found in crisis and the feeling of unluck influencing the recognition of the trigger in a situation where the crisis is not a failure where you can learn from, but a general feeling of uneasiness. How can you find triggers even if not being at your best?
Yeah. Sorry, I'll just reread it again just to be sure. I really, it's for linking how serendipity can be found in a situation where the crisis is not a failure, where you can learn from, but a general feeling of uneasiness. How can you find triggers even if you're not on your best? So it's a really interesting question, right? Because I feel there's like so many different potential answers and so many potential routes we could go into. But I think if you look at situations of unease, when you think about I don't know, and I can just, again, I'm just from kind of what I've seen in my own life, a lot of times you might, especially in situations of unease, right? There's the situations that are objectively uneasy, and I think especially, unfortunately, when it comes to gender dynamics and other things, that I think that's a whole, by the way, study in itself, like how I think when you are in particular groups, that a lot of times there's restraints to how much serendipity can happen because of gender dynamics, racial dynamics, and other kind of questions. So I think there's an objective unease that, again, I think is more a systemic problem we have to also talk about. But I think on the individual end, a lot of times unease, if it's just about individual discomfort because we have to kind of push our comfort zone, that's actually a lot of times where the really interesting, life-changing, bigger things happen, right? Because we might be in a situation that might feel uneasy in the moment, but might actually then open a new world to us. I mean, to give you an example, Daniele, who's a wonderful consultant in Brussels, she was fired from her job which is the toughest situation you can imagine, right? And so it's a very unlucky event, right? To be fired, not based on your own mistakes, but based on like a really bad situation. She went to the train station, she was crying, she was in a really bad mood. There's this guy coming by, they start a conversation, they somehow like recognize something and that they knew each other, even stuff like that. And then kind of like out of this came a new job. My long story short here is that you will never know when those kind of uneasy moments might lead to something like this, even if it's extremely unexpected, and then become that inflection point. I think the way how a lot of times these things tend to happen is that how do you call it? The attitude towards it, right? In terms of like, is it, oh my God, life is over and this is it? And it feels like it in the moment, right? I mean, I remember I had a near-death experience again 2 years ago, almost died of COVID. In those kind of moments, it feels like, oh my God, life is done, right? And it doesn't feel like a potential trigger for serendipity. It just feels like this is it. But for example, in my situation, what it did is it kind of made me rethink, oh my God, I don't have a person here with me. Like, oh my God, I should focus more on my love relationships as well. And, long story short, now here's a baby and a wonderful wife. And again, this is kind of like a very long story cut very short. And I wouldn't have seen that as a potential trigger back then. And I certainly wouldn't have opted to be put in the position of almost dying of COVID. But actually it became that important inflection point. So long story short, I don't think I have a very clear answer for you, but I do feel that it's kind of, if we can in every situation try to perceive it in some kind of way out of perspective in the situation already, because a lot of times we have perspective after time, right? So we might look back 10 years after and think, oh, now I can take perspective. But I think there's a lot of work around resilience where essentially Adam Grant and others do a lot of work around how, when you are in a particular situation, how do you then take yourself out of it and think, what would I, for example, now advise a friend to do? And then we kind of might get out of the dynamic system 1, right, which is emotional and raw, into the system 2 of like cognitive, what do we do with it? Similar to when you have a child, right? Like when a child comes to you and is like, oh my God, life is over because my shoe kind of fell into the river, right? Like the best thing with the child is to say, I'm so sorry. What would you do now? Like, what should we do now? And so what we're doing here is we're trying to get the kid back into the system of thinking rather than the system of kind of like emotional upheaval and things like that. Again, I'm not a psychologist. I'm hesitant to dive deeper into that, and I might have misunderstood the question, but I think it's a great one. I think there's a lot of potential different answers to it.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you. I think it was a wonderful answer, to be honest. And so we will have one last question because we run out of time, but we will run a bit. And it's from Antonia, and it's what's your opinion on everything happens for a reason? How to find the balance between control it and let's call it relying on destiny?
That's a great question. I actually had that conversation recently with someone who's extremely religious. Where in some religions there's this idea of, God has a plan for you, and then that's there. And we agreed actually on. So there's this story, and I'm not doing the story justice, but there's this story where there's this person who always prays to God and says, please let me win the lottery. Please let me win the lottery. And then God never lets them win the lottery. And then at some point the person asks, well, why do you never let me win the lottery? Well, you got to buy a ticket. I can only let you win if you actually buy the ticket. And so to me, that was always beautiful that even in this idea that there might be a plan that someone has, you have some kind of agency that you can do, right? There's something that you can do within that plan to actually be active and do things. And so I think there's a beautiful balance between that. Yes, like if you are religious, there might be something bigger, but at the same time, also our own actions probably still influence something. I found it fascinating, in Eastern philosophy, a lot of Eastern philosophy is so much around the idea of flow and interrelatedness. And I grew up in a not being a big fan of, for example, like religious institutions, but I've always appreciated the deeper underlying values that are at the core of a lot of religions, and that philosophically speaking also are really important. And so a friend of mine who teaches a lot of meditation. So one thing we've realized is that in a way, what religion does with prayer is very similar to what others might do with meditation or so. You're essentially trying to connect to something that's bigger than oneself, right? It could be nature, it could be a bigger purpose, it could be whatever it is, but we all want to connect in some way, right? With whatever it is, a higher force or nature or whatever. And so the point is, I've become a big fan of really kind of sensing that, like, what is it that I feel pull towards? And if it's a higher power in some way or the other, what are the values that are related to it, right? I can't just leave it then passively, but I need to constructively think about the kind of reasons and values. And so I think sometimes religion then in that case can be an interesting guiding force when we focus more on the values that are behind it rather than the kind of exact kind of sentence that someone interpreted in some kind of book for some kind of reasons.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think thank you for all wonderful answers. Unfortunately, we don't have time to answer all the questions. We would love to, but we need to wrap it up. So thank you, Christian, for joining us. We will just share a couple of notes or a couple of information from our side of CEMS Alliance. So thank you for your support and time, and then we will also guys check out all Christian's books. They are very interesting. I recommend. I started reading one, the Serendipity Mindset, but unfortunately I think everybody was super busy. So, and I'm the type of guy who says I'll read this book, and then it takes me 3 months to read it. So, but I hope I'll have time during the summer. And then we just wanted to mention about the digital ethics conference. It's CEMS and Ashisa, and you are cordially invited to join the webinar to learn how companies in Europe and the USA are managing the problems that unethical use of consumer and employee data create when machine learning is used to market products, hire and fire people, reject loan application or other error-prone decisions tools. But you will also learn about the tremendous potential that big data sets in advanced AI and advanced AI can offer to our society. So definitely feel free to check it out and sign up. And the other information, the other invite we have for you is the Vivatech conference in Paris 2022 is just around the corner, so register for your free ticket today or as soon as possible via the CEMS alumni platform. And you may also make a donation to our CEMS Alumni Association donation fund. We will be extremely delighted to receive something and to keep these webinars going. And also, don't forget, there will be a follow-up email regarding the feedback about the survey. So if you have time, we will definitely appreciate your feedback. Thank you, Christian, for joining us today. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and we will see each other. We will be delighted to see you on the next episode. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Victor, for the great presentation and moderation, and looking forward to keeping in touch with everyone. Please feel free to connect Twitter, LinkedIn, wherever you are. And thanks so much, Melissa, for making this happen. Thank you. Goodbye.